Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure and a privilege to have Professor Arjun Appadurai, a close friend, back in Vienna. He was, some 15 years ago, a fellow at the IWM. Unfortunately, he's not a fellow of ours this year, but fortunately, he's spending his sabbatical in Berlin, so he's not jet-lagged and has arrived in good shape from our neighboring country. Most of you know Professor Appadurai's work, so actually he doesn't need an introduction, but I will be very, very brief for those of you who do not know all that they need to know about his biography, because that's what I'm going to start with in a moment. Arjun Appadurai is among the leading and among the earliest theorists of globalization in the social sciences. He's a social anthropologist and a sociologist. We make no distinction between the two in India. His career has been an American one to begin with, professorships at the University of Pennsylvania, Yale, Chicago. He was provost at the New School, and he's now the Goddard Professor in Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University in New York. He holds several concurrent appointments, including at Rotterdam and at the Tata School in, at Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. Arjun's work has been wide-ranging. It's in the early, actually I should start maybe the other way around, 1988, Arjun founded a journal, Public Culture, in which there was a focus on the newly developing transnational public sphere. It's one of the most influential journals in its field. But interestingly, in 1988, Arjun has not used the word global yet. He's still talking about transnational. It's 1990 when he writes this extremely influential article, Disjuncture and Difference in the Global Cultural Economy, and that is what starts, in a way, the career of globalization as a social science concept, and, if I may be forgiven for saying so, also Arjun's global career. The article has been translated in very many languages, as have many of his books. Arjun has written on cultural globalization, on violence, on democracy, on transformations of contemporary capitalism. His latest work is on finance capital, the decline and the uncertain future of the nation state. He has also worked a lot on issues of migration and on media. I'm going to focus today on your earlier work, Arjun, with your permission, the notion of scapes, from which you may want to escape by now, but I'm going to take you back to your 1990s work on globalization, because I think it may be interesting to revisit it with you and to think about what today, looking back on your own work in the 90s, you may want to rethink. The three books that I'm going to be mentioning today, so I would like to mention the titles very briefly. Modernity at Large, which contains the essay, which I have just mentioned, among other essays on cultural globalization. The Fear of Small Numbers, in 2006, with a subtitle which I think will resonate with many of us, an essay on the geography of anger. And I think this is a book I'm going to come back to in the discussion as well. And his latest book, The Future as a Cultural Fact, Essays on the Global Condition. They have been translated into French. Many are available in German, Spanish, Portuguese, Japanese, Chinese, and Italian. So a warm welcome to you, Arjun, and thank you very much for coming. I'm going to start with a personal question. As you may have noticed, our festival, it's the first Vienna Humanities Festival. When we were deciding what the theme should be, I suggested displacement. A German translation could not be found. So we turned it into anderen Orts, and which cannot be translated into English properly. Therefore, in English, we called it Out of Place. And what I want to start with is to ask you, if you think about your own biography and your own work, this is a question of belonging. It is also a question of location. It's also a question of being in several places. And I think what is characteristic about your theoretical approach to globalization have been, for me, two things. One, that it takes the cultural dimension extremely seriously, adds to it a subjective dimension, which it takes equally seriously. But with the notion of the scape, what you do is to add a perspectivity, a perspectival dimension to the subjective. And if I ask you then to start personally, before you go into the theoretical notions of the ethnoscapes and the mediascapes, the question, what does it mean for you to be out of place in different places in different ways? Are you at home anywhere? Are you out of place everywhere? Are you out of place in the same way in different places?
I hope this is working, so I'm going to proceed then. First, to say thank you to all the organizers of this wonderful festival, which I did not know this was the first of. So I'm doubly honored. So thanks to all the organizers, some of whom are here, and some of whom could not be here, and also to my dear friend and interlocutor today, Shalini Randeria, Professor Randeria, for her very generous opening remarks. I'm really very happy to be in her company and to be in the company of colleagues from the IWM, from the museum, and from other organizations in this city, to which I have been now perhaps 3 or 4 times, starting 15 or so years ago, but periodically since then, not often, so I can't say I know it well. But what can I say? Vienna occupies a space in the lives of many of us who have been nowhere near Vienna for much of our lives. And for those of us exposed to Western ideas, I need hardly tell you in this audience that Vienna is remarkable and special. And I remember very early in my stay in the United States reading Peter Gay's work on fin de siècle Vienna, and then slowly discovering that Freud was a Vienna person, that Wittgenstein was a Vienna person. And so this is a fabled history, and of course I'm not going to try and tell you all of those fables, but many of us, even in far away places like India, knew that there was something about Vienna. And I say Vienna rather than Austria because our geography in other places was not always very strong. So we did not always know where was Austria and where was Germany and where was it, but we knew cities. So I'm very happy to be here. And so I'll turn with that thought to Shalini's very well put and very thought-provoking question, which is at least in part biographical, to say that the sense of being both out of place and at the same time at home probably began for me without much reflection or education or reading in the city we share, Bombay, now called Mumbai, which of course many of you know about, some of you probably have visited. But it's a city with, 7 or 8 or 9 languages spoken on a regular basis. It is without doubt one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world, and certainly in India. It is a place where everybody is from somewhere else, and so everybody is at home, but everybody is also out of place. So everybody's out of place and in place at the same time. And that feeling in Mumbai, I think, has become more problematic, more tense, more difficult. But when I grew up, it was mostly a source of pleasure, delight in other languages, languages which you didn't grow up with, but which you learned at school, or languages which were not at school, but which were your neighbors' languages. So in Bombay, I grew up thinking that speaking many languages, even if not so well, was a natural state of affairs. But I also knew that there were things going on in that city that I didn't have a clue about. I lived a very small life in a certain part of Mumbai with a certain school and certain friends, like most people in most places in the world. So I knew Bombay was big already in the 50s and 60s. Now it is gigantic. It was probably maybe 6 million people or 5 million people then. It's now 15 million or more. But it was already pretty sizable. So I would simply say, as a general reflection to Shalini's question, that feeling both somehow as if you are different and that everybody is different and therefore you're okay, probably goes back to Mumbai. But it was in the process of my move to the United States, which was at a very young age, 18, that I think I began to start thinking about what it meant to be in the West, what other places meant to the West, what it meant to be an Indian in an American university setting. And through one or other set of things, I began to align my research and I should call it my reading interests in those subjects. And in the period when I was an undergraduate and a graduate student, the general key word was not globalization. If you wanted to think about what the world was like, it was modernization. Who was more modern, who was less modern, who was modern in this way, who was modern in that way. And most of us were taught to believe that if you came from outside the US or Europe, you were always eternally in a kind of deficit economy. You had less modernity than the place you were in. So you always had a modernity deficit. So my thinking about globalization, I think, began with my thinking about modernization. What is modernization? Who owns it? Can everybody be modern? Can anybody be modern? Does it take something special, education, training, and so on? And somewhere, I think in the 80s, I and many other people realized that modernization somehow was too simple an idea. It was a kind of one-way street, or it was like a marathon, and there were winners, and there were people who were only going to make it in 3 hours, and people who were going to make it in 5 hours, and people who would never make it. But then this transnational business entered what Shalini, before globalization became a key word, and many of us in the social sciences and in the adjacent humanities began to see that modernity was itself, if I may borrow a word from idea from Zygmunt Bauman, kind of liquid thing, flowing here and there. It was not in a single line or track where everybody was lined up, but it was a moving thing. And so we began to think about transnational processes, diaspora, migration, but not only of people, of anything and everything, money, objects, technologies, and so on. And then around the fall of the Berlin Wall, at least in my history, there was a coincidence that in '89 was when I began to think about globalization due to some provocations which were purely accidental. And I wrote the article that Shalini so kindly mentioned. And after that, my ideas about modernization, transnational processes, all began to be seen through the lens of this idea that the world is becoming connected in a way that is different than in previous eras. Not for the first time, but somehow different. So that's connected in my case, to go back to Shalini's personal side of the question, to a certain amount of movement from India at age 18 to a small university in the US, actually a very good university called Brandeis, but it was small, and then later to bigger ships like Chicago and so on. So I was moving, but I will end this longish response to Shalini's wonderful question by saying that now that I'm actually trying to live in Berlin, I realize for the first time that I'm actually trying to make a life, an apartment, a bank account, and so on and so forth, in a world in which English is not everywhere. English was everywhere in Bombay, certainly in my milieu, and of course, some kind of English was everywhere in the US. But now, there's, of course, many people who are bilingual in Germany, but many people who are not, who are less fluent. But the short thing to say is, I'm experiencing in Berlin, though everyone is wonderful, the city is beautiful, great, it has its complexities, but my experience is very surrounded by generous people. But at some subjective level, I would say, perhaps this is an extreme formulation, that at my advanced age, I'm experiencing a kind of sense of dislocation, being out of place, that I have not experienced, though I have been all over the world and I've been happy to be. I'm from India and I've lived in the US. But this, and I think language is quite an important part of it. So I'll stop there to say, this may be the right year for me to come and give a talk in this symposium or discussion.
So, Arjun, I'm going to pick up 2 points from your earlier work. One, an idea and a term which you introduce and which does a lot of work for you in those essays, and that is the term of deterritorialization. What you have described at the moment is an individual dynamic and movement, because I asked you for a personal story on this. But if I understood your idea of deterritorialization well, this was about populations out of place. This was about collectivities out of place. And what you linked it to in the earlier work was ethnoscapes. The movements of people who were as a collectivity out of place. But then, interestingly, you linked it both to the rise of ethnic nationalisms in the diaspora, so diasporic nationalisms, and transnational processes of political support by these communities to what you described as their imagined homelands. And I think you were very prescient on this, because we are talking about the 90s when you're writing about phenomena which have taken on a very virulent shape today. So if you think back on that work, the question is, what would you describe is, do you think anything has changed in the dynamics of deterritorialization in the collectivities which are populations out of place, in a sense, and the kinds of politics of also violence, hatred, have also been sometimes supportive politics, diaspora politics, of democratization in the homeland?
That's again a very wonderful and very deep question, Shalini, because it's both about changes in how I or you or others have been thinking over, say, 20 or 25 years, but it's simultaneously a question about the world. And that's always challenging, because all of us have to struggle to separate things we come to realize because of our lives, our careers, from real changes in the world. So that's always a challenge, but I think it is a good question to ask. So I'll answer it in 2 parts. One, for me, the idea of deterritorialization for populations, for whole groups, has something to do with a period which may be a long period. It may be 50s, 60s, 70s, it may be a little shorter, and if you're a certain kind of historian, it may seem even longer, in which the kind of sense that nation states are natural things, had begun to get disturbed. In other words, the idea that the place where you are, the people you are surrounded by, the language you speak, your intimate relations are all more or less coordinated or symmetrical, and that is the way of things. I think many of us, certainly I, when I grew up in India, partly due to my ignorance, thought this is the way things are. Of course everybody is Indian. India is an eternal thing. Of course, India had been created 2 years before I was born, but I thought it had been there for 5,000 years. The history books encouraged me to do that. Later I learned that every country thinks that, and the histories only vary between 30 years, 50 years, Switzerland 100 years, somebody else 120, but I'm still to find 130, 140. But everybody thinks it's 3,000, 4,000, 5,000. But we all sort of felt that. And I think in the 70s, 80s, especially 90s, that had come to be disturbed for more and more people, both people who were themselves out of place, who had moved in large numbers, and the people who were in one place and were managing that. States, other authorities also began to realize that because there's so many people around in their care, so to speak, or within their borders, who were out of place, that they had to think about the place differently than they thought before. Because it was not just 1 or 2 tourists, 10 or 15 students, it was big groups who were both there and not there. So I think that period, let's say 25 years ago, was the first period in which the sense of the naturalness of national orders came to be unsettled. Today, to fast forward, I would say, of course, many things continue. Many of those things have intensified. More migrants, more dual commitments to your new place and your old place, more going back and forth. All of that has increased in numerically and in intensity. We all know that modern media has intensified people's sense of where they can be at the same time, etc. Internet, Skype, mobile phones, and so on, all remarkable changes in a very short period. So change indeed, lots of things continuous and only intensifying, but I would say that if I had to make a general characterization, which would hold for Europe, but also to some extent for the US and for other parts of the world like India or other parts of Asia, that sense of dislocation or lack of fit between identity, place, loyalty, and so on, has become somewhat part of everybody's anxiety. States, migrants, no one is sitting, as it were, completely secure. So if you take the US, the people who have just come, let's say undocumented migrants from Mexico or elsewhere, as well as Donald Trump, the most hyper-privileged, are all anxious. What is the US? Who is the US? Where is the wall? Who's coming in? No one is sitting very complacent. So I would say the big change in regard to deterritorialization is that no one is free anymore, I think, of the feeling that these primary connections between place and identity, sovereignty, borders is just fine, and there are a few disturbances that we have to manage. The sense that the disturbances are what is central, I think, has become endemic. And I would say that might be the most important difference between 2016 and, say, 1990 or 1995.
This is interesting that that's a difference you point to, because in preparing for this conversation with you, I looked back at both the books, Modernity at Large and then The Fear of Small Numbers, and I found that the shift is already made there by you, whereas Modernity at Large contains essays which I won't say they're absolutely celebratory of globalization, but they still are more, they are emphasizing the emancipatory side of it, the aspirational side of it, cultural globalization. And one of the major insights, I think, which you have there is to point to the fact that there is a new role for imagination in social life. It's about images, these are media images, these are imaginaries, and these are imagined communities, but you coin a very nice phrase where you say it's about imagined worlds. People can imagine other places, and that is one of the aspects of cultural globalization, which gives it this aspirational side. By the time you write A Fear of Small Numbers, it's the psychopolitics of anxiety and fear. The fear of small numbers points, of course, to the demographic dynamics, which are playing a huge role today in all the public discourses around us. In all these countries, it's about Muslims taking over, they're reproducing too fast, it's about Europeans dying out, but we know it from home, or one of our homes, we know it from India. This constant fear that, in the 1920s, the Hindus thought they were a dying race, that the Muslims with their 4 wives and 14 children are going to outnumber all of us, etc., etc. So there is a whole history of the demographic fear as a motor of a certain kind of ethnic nationalism, which plays out in many places, and yet it's towards the mid-2000s that you crystallize it in The Fear of Small Numbers, where your emphasis shifts from the aspirational side of cultural globalization to its darker side, to the violence. And what I would like to reflect with you on here is, how do you see these two sides as intermeshed? I mean, that there are two sides is very clear. Your own work, I think, in a way progresses from the one to the other. And yet the question is, how do they go together structurally?
Also a very, I think, deep question, a challenging one. Certainly when I wrote Fear of Small Numbers and it came out in 2006, 10 years after Modernity at Large, many things had happened, including 9/11, and since I was in the US, it was a big thing. But the war on terror had become a global currency.
Breakup of Yugoslavia.
Breakup of Yugoslavia, that had happened already in the 90s, but clearly its results were being more and more felt. In short, it was evident that the kind of optimism that I and others felt when the wall came down for Europe, for the West, but for the world, had to be rethought, because there were other potentials, actually opposite potentials, of shrinkage of the imagination, of a kind of localizing of identity. All this exactly opposed to the opening up, to communication, to the imagination of bigger spaces, larger possibilities. But in already 2004, while I was trying to process the violence, the war on terror, the kind of civilizational struggle that was being portrayed as a struggle between Islam and Christendom or the West, all those things, I also wrote an essay, part of a different stream of my work, which overlaps with your interests also in development, which has to do with aspiration and the capacity to aspire. So that was also underneath. And then in 2013, I put together another collection of essays, which you also were kind enough to mention, called The Future as Cultural Fact, where I think a fuller co-presence of these things is there. That is, I both see that our world is very much at risk. And I would say, even since 2013, I now see clearly what I'm not alone in seeing, which is a global shift to the right. Modi, the leader of China, Putin, Trump, any number of leaders in Europe, and then any number worldwide, who you can see simply moving to a stronger sense of national purity, exclusion of outsiders, closing of borders, economic protectionism. This is one, to me, of the major secular trends. And somebody recently pointed out to me, actually my older son, who's 38, he said, Hillary Clinton is actually the representative of what used to be the Republican Party. Trump is somewhere else in a space it's hard to describe, that she is no longer, as it were, any classical Democrat. She's a solid Republican. Wall Street, this, that. But Republican Party is in smithereens, so she's therefore a Democrat, and then Trump is in, as I say, his own space. But what this means that even in the US, you can take the whole spectrum has moved to the right. Not only that the right wing is more active, but everybody is further right than they used to be. So the left, so someone like Bernie Sanders, just to talk about the US for a minute, is a startling figure because he's so out of place, if I may say, in today's United States. But even he is not a blazing, advocate of proletarianization, of, working men's liberation. He is, just saying, let's control the big money, let's be a little honest. This is considered super left. And Hillary is considered democratic, and Trump is whatever Trump is. So even the US overall, and if I look at India, it's the same thing. The only question is, how far right are you? It's not about, the left is really not very active, and progressive popular movements are not in official politics. They are among people like Dalits and others. So there's a very huge movement of untouchables, etc., which is very dramatic, but it's not in official politics. Official politics is right, righter, rightist. And frankly, I see that everywhere. I look at the local elections, though I know nothing about Berlin and Germany beyond some newspapers and books here and there. But it's evident that in the local elections going on in and around Berlin, that is the question. How far right are you going to be? So Merkel's party looks terrific compared to alternative and so on. But if you say, what is Merkel's party? It's not exactly blazing left liberalism. It's fairly conservative, and then so on and so forth. So everywhere, and perhaps Austria is the same, that it's tough to find real left of center in an older sense. It's just right, righter, rightist. So these thoughts come to me, Shalini, from your question that we have this kind of global swing to the right, but my own view is we do have still today, in a very powerful form, a kind of dramatic tension between official politics, state elites, corporate elites, governments, more and more just debating how far right to be, whether on money issues, migration issues, doesn't matter. But at the grassroots level, if you look at movements like Black Lives Matter, if you look at Dalits, if you look at certain rural movements in different parts of the world, and so on and so forth, you still see, or slum dwellers with whom I worked in India, a huge aspirational politics, which is progressive, which is democratic, which is right-centered. And I think the Arab Spring showed us some of that, even if it did not last and last and last, it still was important. So there is that, but official politics seems to be going in this darker direction. So I would say today, it is still very important to understand how, if I may put it in a very simple way, because that's all I see so far, globalization, which has made us more connected in reality, in travel, in communication, in media, in economics and so on, connection, has simultaneously opened the horizons of the imagination for many people, made it possible for them to think of moving, changing their lives, etc., but has simultaneously pushed others to close down, to shrink, and to exclude. There was a time, 20, 25 years ago, when this paradox or tension was explained in a straight action-reaction way. There are people who are scared of this new thing, so they close down. This is kind of jihad versus McWorld and all that. I think this is too simple. I think that there's a more complex reason why opening and closing are happening more intensely together. And I believe for social scientists, it's very important to understand how globalization can have these somewhat contradictory results, each of which is real, and each of which, I should add, takes on a different chemistry and physics in every region, every nation, but there is some commonality that at least I feel in this tension. No society that I'm aware of is entirely closed, shut down, and in agreement that we want nothing to change and we want no newcomers, etc. And no society is a willkommen society, 100%. These impulses are at war all over the place. Not just the West is standing for openness and Muslims or somebody else is for closing. It's everywhere that this tension is being played out. So that, to me, is my current sense of our challenge or dilemma.
Before I open out to questions from the audience, one last question, because in a way it brings me full circle. What your recent work has been describing is a politics of hope, a new terrain for a politics of hope. And I think that's extremely important in a climate of the kind of anxiety and fear which is driving a lot of electoral behavior and electoral politics. Certainly, it's not, as you very rightly point out, driving grassroots mobilization. We saw that in Vienna as well. When we had all of these refugees in the train station, the official response was, first of all, lukewarm, then more welcoming. It swung quickly in Germany, as you have seen, to the other side, as in many other places as well. But the grassroots response was an extremely welcoming one to begin with. People who went out helped a lot, brought things personally from their homes, welcomed the refugees, and that continues. The media pays less attention to that than the gloomier side, but nevertheless, that continues. And what you point out to is the fact of the conditions of possibility under which a politics of hope is possible. But what it's one thing here, it is about civil society response to helping refugees. In the cases which you describe, it's the urban poor organizing to help themselves. So there you have a very interesting idea when you say this politics of hope, this capacity to aspire, as you call it, has to do with improvisation. The ability to improvise and to improvise for better living conditions. However, of course, when I was reading it, I was struck by the fact that the poor must improvise. They are forced to improvise. So the force of that improvisation in their lives is very different from the improvisation that you and I, as privileged cosmopolitans, can exercise when we exercise our imaginations and practices around it.
That's perfectly true, Shalini, and a wonderful note on which to at least bring this part of our conversation to conclusion before people raise their own questions. It reminds me that if you ask me, given the gloomy possibilities that surround us here and in the rest of the world, what is the basis for believing in a politics of hope? Not just wishing, but actually believing that it's possible, that there could be conditions under which it is realized or realizable. I would say something of this, let's call it cosmopolitanism or cosmopolitanization from below. Even though it's compulsory, you're absolutely right that poor people who have no homes, who live on the pavements in Mumbai and so on, are also cosmopolitans because they speak 2 or 3 languages, they have to deal with people very different than themselves, and if they don't, they're in trouble. So they are not cosmopolitans who are going for foreign study programs. They're not on Erasmus and taking new languages. They have to be extending their cultural horizons, their class horizons, because otherwise they will go under. They will lose their minimum existing life conditions will also disappear. So they have to negotiate with others. I do believe that that impulse, which is the negotiations that poor or less privileged people do to learn the skills of taking on difference and doing so successfully, are the practical conditions under which people learn things like tolerance. So tolerance is not something that is going to come out of by going to, some retreat somewhere, or by reading Paul Hacker, who's a great philosopher of Germany, who first talked about inclusivismus and tolerance and so on. That is good for us. But in the world, you learn tolerance, or if you like, to engage with and not celebrate, but certainly support diversity and so on, because you do it in your own struggles to get from today to tomorrow, as a working person, or a slum dweller, or as a woman in hard conditions in any part of the world. That is honestly, I think, when you learn that, let's say, that Turkish worker who is also working with you in some place is also human, and actually together you can accomplish certain things in your daily lives which you can't accomplish alone. I do believe that that is the ground. Now, the political question is, will that kind of daily life collaboration between ordinary people, which allows them to expand their imaginations, imagine solidarity, and so on and so forth, will the conditions of that actually get shrunk by people above, who say, no, you cannot do that, you cannot work with this one, you cannot live here, you must be there, etc. That is a raw reality about power, which requires older debates about the state, about revolution, about change, or about, if you like, elections, policies, and so on. That is important. But minus the daily encounter with difference, and difference successfully negotiated, you can have all the policies in the world. You can have all the enablements, and people in their daily lives will have no interest. Because honestly, the default state is not to explore diversity. I mean, no human being is brought up to say, well, it's wonderful to have people whom you don't understand at all, whom you don't know, you have no sympathy for, you may even dislike. It's great to have them all around you in your job, in your work, in your marriage. I've seen no community of which it could be said that's true. But faced with that condition, people will respond quite positively if their political environment doesn't every day, including the media environment, tell them that this is risky, this is dangerous, this is deadly, this is going to cost you your job, it's going to cost you your neighborhood, it's going to cost you welfare, it's going to cost you whatever. If that can be muted or modified, then I think this daily process has a chance to take hold. But whether and how that can happen is the question we all have to deal with in our own cities and states and communities. How to create those conditions is certainly not something with a quick fix.
With that, let me just open out.
Introduce yourself, please. Could I ask anybody who speaks to just say who they are, so I benefit?
You can have mine. Isabel, you can just have mine, and then after that, Andre in the corner.
Yes, my name is Ramesh Biswas. Arjun, you use the word space as a social scientist would do, as a social space, but as an architect and urban designer, I'd like to hear your thoughts about physical space, because the city has always been the crucible of progress, right? Of meeting people whom you would not meet in your village, right? Of negotiation, of tolerance, of diversity, of potential, of all these things. And that has always been the case and continues perhaps to be the case, whether in Bombay or in New York or Glasgow or wherever. But there is a strong movement in Bombay, in European cities, or similar places like in Southeast Asia, Singapore, and so on, that people don't want to see the refugees taking visible in the space of privilege, of the space of luxury. Yeah, the refugee, the gypsy, the poor, the homeless person, and so on. So do you feel that there, and then of course there are gated communities more and more, and gated communities within the city, not just outside in the suburbs, but within gated offices, gated, so are you talking, do you see narrowing down? And is there still hope? I mean, is there still, the strength of the city as a crucible would overcome this?
Well, thanks very much for that question. I'll be brief because it's a very important and a wide-ranging problem, but I would say what your question raises is something which I haven't said anything about, but which is of interest to me, which is the space where planning and design meet commercial interests in real estate. So in all the cities I know, and then of course there's the state, whether the national state, the regional state, or the city, which has rules or no rules about how rampant commercial development can take place. Because planners and developers and designers can have good ideas about how to mix things up, not to allow gating, enclaving, this and that. But if you have a rampant real estate market that's just running wild, like in Bombay, where Dharavi is slowly being swallowed by developers and many other slums are being just taken apart with all sorts of schemes about FSI and this and that. And New York is full of this, where you can use your air rights and do this and do that, and essentially make vertical developments which then price up the whole neighborhood so that people can't afford to be this. They're not physically pushed out, but they can't afford, so they move. In Berlin, I'm told that there's been a slow creeping process, which is not visible to me, but I'm told about, where many areas of the old East Germany have slowly been gentrified and people are being driven out, from Kreuzberg to Pankow and from here to there and so on, and that these are people who know that they've lost their place, even in a city that, from a New York point of view, is very regulated. You can't just raise rents, you can't just suddenly build 100 stories because you have air rights. Berlin feels very regulated to me, but I'm told that Berlin too, there's a creeping process of driving poorer people, working people out, etc. So, the short answer is planning and design in relation to inclusion, or sometimes what is called smart cities, and although I'm a bit worried about those phrases, are good things, but they will not go anywhere unless you have civic and governmental authorities and a political process which holds rampant and often corrupt commercial real estate development in check. If that cannot be done, forget cities. What you're going to get is radical apartheid. Whether it's vertical apartheid, Singapore apartheid, Sao Paulo apartheid, is all apartheid also, like Tolstoy's families. The varieties are many. But the result is essentially 2 cities or 3 cities in one city. So it's a very loose answer to your important question.
Thank you for your very illuminating presentations, Arjun. I wanted to come back to the issue of refugees and would like to raise the question to you in how far the entire refugee situation that we're dealing with in the Global South and now in Europe as well, still can be conceptualized as a perhaps very radical dimension of flows of globalization alone, or whether this might not also have to do with the fact that we're dealing with a completely different and new global situation as well, in which the previous global Cold War has vanished and has been substituted, in a sense, by a situation of many small hot wars in various parts of the world, ranging from Kashmir to Syria and Iraq and Libya, etc., etc. And this situation of many small hot wars, of course, has its repercussion through the refugees, who are not just labor migrants, but are in fact running away from a war situation.
A truly excellent point, Andre, and put in terms that are very provocative to me, but they are slightly different than my angle on the same dynamic, on which I agree completely. The case in point is Syria. So we can talk of many places, but Syria is surely a case where it doesn't make sense to talk of aspirational movement and so on, although people are aspiring, but above all, they are facing unthinkable brutality, terror, and so on in their daily lives, and that can be seen in many places, Iraq, of course, but really in many more places in the world, there's that kind of hot war, as you put it. In addition, I think the newness of these things, I was reminded of, I had the privilege of giving a short talk at a very high-level meeting organized about 6 months ago, in the heat of this crisis, by the UNCHR in Geneva, where I had the privilege of listening to many people who are experts from UNCHR and from Red Cross and so on, who are dealing with the front line. But the meeting was to ask, beyond the front line, what are the driving causes? My biggest lesson in this, and I'm ashamed to say I hadn't really realized it, was in addition to failed states, imperial incursions, and so on and so forth, there's climate. And that if you look at Africa, particularly, some statistic that I got from a very authoritative voice was about 40% of people in Africa are living nomadic, cattle, and therefore climate-dependent lives. And therefore, climate change has meant that their already complex, transnational, transhuman lives are now posing a fresh order of challenge to the states to which they come and go, and of course to themselves. So climate emerged in this dialogue as a bigger driving force even than these other things, but all of them were recognized. I would say two things, therefore. One is, I think, yes, global flows in a general way, you could say, that is true. But if you want to look more in a more refined way, you would have to say the causal nexus seems to be an order of breakdown, either induced externally or internally, which is of a new scale in many, many parts of the world. I would add one other thing, that on the side of the recipient states, and here Europe stands out, because I'm not sure it's quite yet true in India when people come from Bangladesh or Nepal or somewhere, or in other societies where there are movements, Caribbean and so on, cross lines. But in Europe, I have the luck again to have some graduate students in my own department who are working on not just the refugee crisis, but refugee crisis within the framework of new technologies of personal identification. How are you, biometrics, surveillance, and so on. And one of these young PhD students pointed out that Europe has two agencies, very important. One is called something like Eurosur, and there's another one, but the two of them have very opposed mandates. One is to survey the boats and all in the Mediterranean and simply turn back those that look suspicious, but never ask who's in it, because if the person says, I'm seeking asylum, you have to deal with them differently. This is turn the boat back, do not ask. The other is the minute you hit a border, everything is about who you are. It's exactly only who you are. What is your identity, which is also both identity and verification. Are you really Andre Gingrich? Can you really, etc. So you have two agencies in Europe, but the point I mention this is the technologies on the receiving side are now of a new order of penetration, thoroughness, sharing, speed, precision, or at least aspirational precision. which is brought to bear on. So the causes are somewhat different, and the receiving technologies, particularly in high-tech societies, are also different. So I think 100% right that there may be a general way in which we are continuing to see diasporic aspirations, and I do believe that the whole effort to distinguish economic from, let's say, political refugees is misplaced, that these are all very gray zones, that they should be blurred, and they should be combined, because nobody is lacking in aspiration. And no aspirant is entirely having a wonderful life. Otherwise, they would not be aspiring to move. So these distinctions are problematic. So there are many issues, but I do think there is a kind of change within the general framework of flow, dislocation, and so on. And we are well advised to pay attention both to the generative or outpush dynamics and the reception technologies and dynamics. So I thank you very much.
Isabel, here first, and then you can take mine, and you can just pass it on to Basil.
Professor, I would like to ask you a question about identities, but identities and cultural expectations of those of us who move from one place to the other. You moved me because you studied at the same university I studied at Brandeis, but I had to check the age. It's a 5 years difference. So and if you recall, at the time, the basic division were not foreign students versus Americans. It was Black Americans versus Americans, non-Black Americans, and foreigners were with the mainstream. Just as an anecdote, on my floor, the first year, there was an Indian girl, and a Black student who refused to say hello to anybody came up to her and said, "Reka, are you Black or white?" And she said, "I'm an Indian." They said, "Well, tell us, decide. We have to decide if we should say hello to you or not." So why I mentioned that? At the time, us foreigners, identity was something private, but we tried to be part of the mainstream. I don't know if it was your experience. It seems to me that 40 years later, in my case, since the graduation, now everyone asserts their identity, expects to be, that their differences will be recognized, and I'm just wondering why is this happening? Thank you.
Will you just say who you are?
My name is Mirjana Tomic. I work as a trainer for journalists and diplomats in international media news in Vienna.
And you graduated in 75 or so?
77.
7 years after me.
Oh.
No, that's very important because there were things going on in 69.
Well, you were part of Angela Davis, I assume.
Well, just after Marcusa Davis era, but Vietnam War and the explosive takeover of buildings by Black students at Brandeis, but also elsewhere. It was a very particular 68, shooting of Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. My 3 years were very eventful because there were all these issues at once. Student movement, hippie movement, Black identity, all at play. But I'm sure many of those things were still present in the mid-70s when you were there. But your main question is a very hard one, I must say, because it's one I think many people are trying to follow, which is why, two things. Why this growth in, let's call it, identity talk, or the salience, not just of identity, but of a particular part of one's identity. So it's not just one's professional identity. Are you a professor? Are you this? It is somehow has a biological substrate. Where are you from? Where are your parents? What is your roots? That is, and bodily. Disability, sexual orientation. So if you look across the span, the body is the common thing. What is your hair? What is your race? What is your blood? Or what is your sexual orientation? Are you able or disabled or differently abled? Are you queer? Are you this? All of them have something about the body. So it's not just identity in general, like professional identity, family identity. It's this bodily stuff has come to the fore. certainly I agree with you. Why should that be is a tricky question, but we can also ask which parts of that are actually good, because they are bringing things that were kept very tightly in one sphere, somewhat more to be discussable, so that they're not only shunted off into your private life, but allowed to leak into your public life. There's a part of it that I think that is very good. But there's another part that certainly makes for a kind of self-enclaving, self-isolation, or exclusion, active exclusion. On the normative side, is this good or bad, or even is the bad part of it so bad, etc.? I have a very simple criterion which actually comes out of my American experience, which is you can have a white person in the US, let's say a Trump follower or Trump himself, who has clearly racialized views. You can also have a black person, working woman with 4 children, on welfare and struggling and being oppressed by this and that, also saying, look, we are different, you don't understand, and so on. The difference is that one racism comes with a stick. The other racism is either entirely weak, or the other racialization is either entirely weak, or it's, you might say, aspirational. It's saying, let me celebrate my music, my this, my that. It is not about let me keep you down. Let me put you in jail. So my main question about these assertive identities is, are they in a zero-sum game where for me to be queer, you must not be, or you must cease to be straight? Is that it? Or am I simply saying, look, I'm also okay? That's, to me, the crucial question. But it still leaves open the question, why has this grown as a dimension of public discourse in the West, and increasingly in other parts of the world which are in touch with the West? Why is this question, who are you, in these senses, suddenly become a part of not only public discourse, but also official discourse, where people feel they either must ask it, or they are absolutely not allowed to ask it. Either way, that somehow it's an issue. To this, I don't have a clear answer, except for one thing, which is something for which my only source is the great French thinker Foucault, who said that the nature of the modern state is that its power is a capillary power that works by going deep for its sovereignty into your body. And once you have that as part of the working of the state, it also becomes something potential in public life, though it took 3 centuries for it to become so active. But I would say its roots go back to statistics, state-sponsored surveillance, panoptical things, and that kind of control of the body that the state gradually began to acquire, along with its welfare functions and so on. And Foucault, I think, has for all its problems, the best account of that. And that process, that dynamic seems to me somewhere tied up with why now all of a sudden it's the issue on everyone's mind and everyone's self-presentation and so on. But that's really a speculation. But it's a wonderful and tough question.
Thank you, Arjun. I think there are lots more questions in the room, but we have 2 constraints. One is your schedule. You will miss a plane. And the second...
seek asylum in Vienna.
Yes, we will be very happy, not only to provide you refuge, but also hospitality. And the other constraint is that many of the people in the audience may want a little break and then move on to the next event. But thank you very much for this extremely fascinating and multifaceted conversation, which started with globalization, cultural globalization, ending with the body and personal identities, global, local, and everything in between. This is just to say, this is Arjun Appadurai Part 1. Part 2 follows in June when he is our guest at the IWM. So please take a look at our website. I'm not going to tell you the date so that you also take a look at some of the program in between, and we hope to see you at both the Wien Museum and at the IWM, who are both co-organizers of the festival. Thank you very much.